They turned my quiet piece of heaven into a godforsaken battlefield. And that was the exact moment I realized that even in the middle of nowhere, greed finds a way to crawl over your fence line. I spent 3 years of my life building every single inch of that cedar perimeter with my own 2 hands, every post sunk deep, and every plank leveled until my knuckles were raw and my back felt like it was made of glass. But it was mine. It kept my livestock safe and my life private. Until one Thursday afternoon, when I pulled into the driveway and saw 50 feet of my hard work scattered across the mud like bleached bones after a massacre. I hadn't even killed the engine of my truck before I felt that cold, oily knot of dread tighten in my stomach because the gate was wide open. And in 16 years of working as a county land surveyor, I never, not once, left the gate unlatched. And as I stepped out into the humid air, the smell hit me first, that fresh, sharp scent of splintered wood and the stain I'd just applied last spring, now ruined and trampled into the ruts of heavy tire tracks I didn't recognize. There was this eerie silence, the kind that follows a storm, and pinned to the only post still standing was a piece of paper with a bright orange thumbtack, glowing like a warning light in the setting sun. So I ripped it down with shaking hands and saw the logo of the Oak Creek Estates Homeowners Association staring back at me with its pretentious little gold leaf font. It was notice of compliance action, typed in a font so bureaucratic it made my skin crawl, claiming my fence didn't end oppos, team meet, community aesthetic standards, and that they'd done me a massive favor by removing the, visual obstruction, to maintain, neighborhood harmony, And I just stood there, reading it over and over while the blood started to hammer in my ears, because here's the kicker. I wasn't part of their HOA, not even close. My 12 acres sat a full 140 feet outside their legal boundary, but apparently, someone in one of those cookie-cutter mansions a quarter mile up the hill decided my fence was ruining their, pastoral view, and they thought they could just march onto my land and tear down what didn't in oppos belong to them. Then I heard the lowing, that deep, distressed sound a cow makes when she's lost and scared, and my heart nearly stopped when I realized my oldest Hereford, Bessie, the one I bottle-fed when her mother died 7 years ago, was gone, vanished through the gap where my protection used to be, and that was the moment this stopped being about wood and property lines and started being a war. I spent the next 3 hours in the dark with a heavy-duty flashlight, calling for her until my voice was hoarse, and when I finally found her tangled in a thicket of brambles near the creek with a deep gash on her hind leg, I didn't in oppos. Feel relief. I felt a slow-burning, white-hot rage that I hadn't known I was capable of. The next morning, I didn't call a lawyer right away. I went straight to the source, driving down to that pristine, red brick community office that looked more like a fortress than a neighborhood center, and I walked through those glass doors smelling like manure and cedar sawdust, which definitely didn't in oppos. Fit there, aesthetic, The woman behind the mahogany desk, Diane Sterling, looked at me like I was a smudge on her windshield, smoothing her $500 blazer with these perfectly manicured nails before offering me a smile that was about as warm as a freezer burn. Mr. Miller, I assume you in oppos. Rehear about the corrective action, she said, her voice sounding like honey poured over a razor blade. And when I told her, as calmly as I could, that she'd committed criminal trespass and property destruction on land she had zero authority over, she just tilted her head and gave me this little condescending sigh. Community is not defined by invisible lines on a map. Silas, she told me, and I swear I almost lost it right then, Your property affects our residents and oppos, quality of life, and when families pay a premium for a view of the rolling hills, we have an obligation to ensure that view isn and oppos. Marred by rustic eyesores, I told her those families bought houses next to a working farm, and if they didn't in oppos, like the view of a fence, they shooed in oppos. Have moved to the country, but she just slid a document across the desk. Voluntary cooperation agreement, telling me that if I signed it and agreed to their oversight, they'd graciously help pay for a new, approved, fence. I looked at that paper and saw exactly what it was, a land grab wrapped in a ribbon, because by signing, I'd be giving them veto power over my livestock, my barn, and my livelihood, effectively turning my farm into an extension of their manicure playground. I stood up, leaning over her desk until that fake smile of hers finally started to flicker, and I told her she'd just made the most expensive mistake of her life. But as I turned to leave, I saw it, a massive, in quote, master development map, in quote, on the wall behind her. My farm was shaded in bright yellow, right in the center of what they called, in quote, Phase 4 expansion, in quote, and there was a little note in the corner that said, in quote, acquisition pending, in quote. Everything clicked into place like a deadbolt. The fence wasn't an oppos. T and I saw it was an obstacle, and they were trying to harass me into a corner until I sold cheap, so they could plow my pastures into another 50 lots of suburban sprawl. I pulled out my phone, pretended to check a text while I snapped a high-res photo of that map, and walked out of there without saying another word, feeling the weight of the war shifting in my favor because Diane Sterling didn't end oppos. T realized she wasn't an oppos. T dealing with just some, in quote, grumpy farmer, in quote. She was dealing with a man who had spent 15 years documenting every legal boundary in this county, and I knew exactly where the bodies were buried in the recorder in oppos' office. The next 2 weeks were a nightmare of escalating psychological warfare, where anonymous letters started showing up in my mailbox telling me to, in quote, sell your dump and leave, in quote. And someone even went as far as to dump a truckload of construction debris right in front of my main gate at 3 in the morning. I saw Diane's hand in all of it, especially after a friend who lived in the HOA forwarded me an email she'd sent to the entire community, painting me as a, in quote, hostile neighbor, in quote, who was tanking their property values out of pure spite, turning people I'd known for years into enemies who wooed into oppos. To even look me in the eye at the grocery store. But while they were playing dirty, I was playing smart, digging through the county archives with the help of an old colleague until I found the, in quote, smoking gun, in quote. Diane Sterling wasn't oppos. T just the HOA president. She was the silent managing partner of the very development company that stood to make $10 million if they could get their hands on my acreage. I'll never forget the night a woman named Evelyn knocked on my door, looking over her shoulder like she was a spy in a Cold War movie. She'd been on the board for a decade and was sick of Diane using the HOA as her personal piggy bank and bulldozer. She handed me a manila folder that contained the actual minutes from the, in quote, emergency session, in quote, where they authorized the destruction of my fence and wooed into oppos. T, you know it, they hadn't in oppos. T even invited the full board. They'd faked the notice periods, and Diane had never once disclosed her financial interest in the land expansion. In quote, she thinks she and oppos, as untouchable, Silas, in quote. Evelyn told me, her voice trembling just a little bit, in quote. She thinks you and oppos, read just a relic of the past that can be paved over, in quote. I just looked at those documents, feeling this strange, calm clarity wash over me as I realized I didn't into oppos. T just have a case. I had a wrecking ball. The lawsuit we filed was a thing of beauty, 32 pages of trespass, conversion, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty, but the real theater happened at the HOA annual meeting 2 weeks later, an event Diane had planned as her victory lap. I waited in the back of that community hall, wearing my best work shirt, listening to her stand on that stage and talk about, in quote, vision, in quote, and in quote, harmony, in quote, while she subtly hinted that the, in quote, problematic adjacent property, in quote, would soon be integrated into the Oak Creek family. When the floor opened for public comment, I didn't in oppos. TL, I didn't in oppos. T-scream. I just walked up the microphone, plugged my laptop into the projector system Evelyn had helped me access, and put that photo of the Phase 4 maps side by side with her development company's incorporation papers. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet as the room went ice cold, and I spent the next 10 minutes calmly explaining to 400 of my neighbors exactly how their dues were being used to fund a private developer's harassment campaign, and how Diane Sterling was planning to build houses in the very, in quote, pastoral views, in quote, she claimed to be protecting. The chaos that broke out was like nothing I've ever seen. People were standing up, shouting, demanding her resignation on the spot, while Diane just stood there behind the podium, her face turning this ghostly shade of gray as she realized her, in quote, untouchable, in quote, empire was evaporating in the light of a simple projector. The legal fallout was swift and brutal. The judge didn't in oppos. T just awarded me the $8,000 for the fence in Bessie and Oppos. S vet bills, he tacked on $25,000 in punitive damages for, in quote, willful and malicious conduct, in quote, and issued a permanent injunction that basically built a legal wall around my farm that no HOA could ever climb. Diane had to resign in disgrace. Her development project was tied up in so many ethics investigations that the investors pulled out within a month, and last I heard, she had to sell her own, in quote, estates, in quote, home just to cover her legal fees. I rebuilt my fence, this time with reinforced steel posts and a gate that could stop a tank, and sometimes, when the sun is setting just right over the east pasture and Bessie is grazing peacefully in the tall grass, I look up at those houses on the hill and wonder if they still enjoy the view. It's a funny thing about, in quote, harmony, in quote. It usually works out a lot better when you respect the lines people have drawn for themselves, but I still see those residents looking down on my land, and I can in Oppos. T help but feel like this ISN in Oppos. T really over because greed like that doesn't in Oppos. T just disappear, it just goes into hibernation. So, I'm curious, what would you have done if you came home to find your life's work torn down by people who thought they were, in quote, above the law, in quote, because they live in a fancier zip code? Is there ever a point where, in quote, neighborhood standards, in quote, actually justify crossing a line, or is an HOA just a corporate bully with a lawnmower? Let me know in the comments, because I have a feeling my story is just one of many, and I want to know if I'm the only one who thinks the, in quote, pastoral view, in quote, is better when it's behind a fence you actually own.